Paul, they say the PM and the Treasurer, this is very much a pandemic budget, and I want to hope that, that's their only excuse as Liberals for this sort of spending. But it's also very much the sort of budget you might have in and around the time of election. They're incumbent, it's in the next 12 months. I don't find it particularly unusual that it's got so much political retail activity in the budget. Is that criticism unfair today?
Peter, I think the framing of the budget as a pandemic budget is really important in both a rhetoric and policy sense. What the government is talking about here is it's saying that the pandemic is still raging and that while the emergency phase of economic support is over, we're now in a new phase, and the new phase is called securing the recovery. The government sees the period running up to the next election and the next election as being about securing the recovery after the pandemic. So they equate spending with security. They're focusing on protecting the Australian people in a health sense and in an economic sense. And if they can make the next election about that issue, not about climate change, not about women's issues, then the government's going to be in a very, very powerful position. That will be a very difficult election framework for Labor to cut through on. So that's the sort of atmospherics about the election. And then, of course, that leads to the policy. And, of course, in this budget, we've seen a fundamental policy revolution.
Just on that, Paul, you said in all of about a minute a much tighter strategy outline there in relation to the terms on which the contest will be fought between Labor and Liberal at the next election than I've heard anyone say, a politician or otherwise, in the last 24 hours. And I think you're absolutely right. It's critical that that's where they need to be because the other areas are fraught. They're fraught for the government. They took a lot of bark off them at the top of the year in relation to women. So this is about a pivot onto the ground of economics and security, two good hallmarks for the coalition, and bringing them in together. It's just whether or not they've got the currency after 8 years to make that stick, and they don't see themselves, in my view, dislodged from the heritage of Liberal economic budgets of the past. Where do you rate this budget in terms of the history of Costello, the history of hockey in terms of budget repair, debt and deficit?
I see this budget, and I make my comments here, Peter, based on what the budget itself says, what the numbers say, and what the Treasurer said in his speech. So I see this budget as a budget of transformation. This is a budget for a new global economic order and a new Australian economic order. It is a fundamental change in Liberal Party history. We are now seeing the embrace of new ideas in terms of the Liberal Party. Certainly, if you look at the spending agenda, this is not a short-term sugar hit. The numbers are very clear. This is a new norm for the Liberal Party and a new higher level of government spending, much higher than we saw from the Labor Party during the Rudd-Gillard era. And this is all about the role of fiscal policy after the pandemic, the fact that monetary policy is near exhausted with interest rates close to zero. So I think we're seeing a new global era here of economic policy, an Australian economic policy, in which it's more active government, bigger spending, and the argument is that these higher levels of deficit and debt can be financed because interest rates are low. So this is a fundamental
let me just jump in there. And look, let me just jump in there because the cheap money argument works when money is cheap, but eventually money is not cheap, and you got to sort of pay the piper. What I find interesting, around the world they've borrowed heavily, almost universally. In Australia, that's not been the case. In fact, we've had governments, as you know, come in and repair the damage and get us back onto an even keel. Rudd and Gillard spent what we had there in cash and savings and surpluses. This time round, we're spending big, but we're spending with borrowed money. And I guess my point is, again, I understand the politics of the pandemic, but there's also the brutal budget reality that at some point there has to be a pathway back. Do you think there is enough evidence from last night that there is a Liberal pathway back?
Well, there has to be a pathway back, but what the government is doing is it's postponing fiscal consolidation for a pretty significant period of time. So the priorities in this budget
into the next decade.
Fighting the virus.
Into the next decade.
Well, essentially, spending will be at a new plateau for the rest of the coming decade. There's no question about that. Now, there'll be gradual reductions in the deficit over the course of the decade, but 10 years from now, the budget papers say we will still be in deficit. So what this indicates is the priority in this budget is fighting the virus and fighting unemployment. And the third priority of fiscal consolidation and repairing the budget is a very distant priority. That's put off for quite some time. Now, is there a risk here? Yes, there is a risk here. And the heart of the risk is what happens to interest rates, because the budget papers argue we can do this because interest rates are so low, and so therefore annual interest repayments are certainly capable of being met comfortably, and they are in fact the same now as they were before the pandemic. All this works, but what happens down the track if interest rates do increase again? Well, that's going to lead to pain for households and pain for government. So, of course, there are risks. I think you've got to say, though, that this budget has got a lot of economic support. The government was urged on this course of action by both the Treasury and the Reserve Bank. And what we're seeing with this budget is an extraordinary coincidence and highly convenient coincidence of opinion here between the economic advice given by the Reserve Bank and the Treasury on one hand and the government's political re-election needs on the other hand, given the election will have to be sometime in the course of the next 12 months.
We'll see what happens now. Long way to go. 13th deficit last night. By your reckoning, there are another decade of them. That's what the budget papers say too. So 23 deficits before we see any sunlight on the surplus front. Paul Kelly, thank you for your time.